all today. Um, I am going to share my screen um, so that, apologies if you hear my dog in the background. Of course, as soon as I get started is when he decides to start barking. Um, so I will just give an overview of where the presentation today is going to go. There's a lot that we could talk about when it comes to transgender rights, and I want to use the time today for 35 minutes or so before opening it up for questions and answers to give a broad kind of landscape overview of where we are right now, and then touch on a number of kind of the most salient issues where we're seeing kind of the push and pull as it comes to transgender rights right now. So just by way of introduction, I'm the legal director at GLAD Law, GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders. We work in New England and nationally to create a just society free of discrimination based on gender identity and expression, HIV status, and sexual orientation. And we use all legal tools that are available to us, including strategic litigation, public policy advocacy, and education. And though while we are a legal organization, I'll just be sharing information tonight and won't be able to provide any specific legal advice. Though, if folks do have specific legal questions, we do have a hotline, Glad Law Answers, that is available on our website. Um, Again, just by way of introduction, Glad Law has worked for now nearly 50 years to try to secure um, our mission, and that has included arguing and successfully obtaining marriage equality across New England and in the Obergefell Supreme Court case. GLAD Law was one of the organizations responsible for early wins for transgender non-discrimination and protections for transgender students. We've done a lot of groundbreaking work when it comes to HIV non-discrimination, treatment and prevention, access to healthcare, and still to this day, we do a lot of work related to ensuring that the law protects all families, including LGBTQ plus families. So I thought I'd start on kind of just a 101 and broad landscape overview of where we are right now. And then I would pivot to, specific issue areas where we're again seeing kind of the push and pull as it relates to legal protections for transgender individuals. I think kind of just setting a baseline, there are some kind of key terms that are important to define for purpose of a conversation about transgender rights. Um, so you hear a lot about, this term gender identity. And for most people, gender identity is established at a young age and is impervious to external influences. And for most people, one's gender identity, their internal sense of gender, aligns with their birth sex. And so their gender identity and their birth sex match. For transgender people, that's not the case. For transgender people, their gender identity is inconsistent with their birth sex. Um, Now, for transgender people, if they are not supported to live in a way that is consistent with their gender identity, they experience or can experience distress. And when that distress rises to a clinical level, it manifests in what's called gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria is a recognized medical condition that is real and serious, and where there's an established course of care for both adolescents who are experiencing gender dysphoria and adults as well. And the established course of care for individuals with gender dysphoria is gender transition. And that can be through social transition, so changing one's name to reflect their gender identity, for example. It can be used through puberty blockers for eligible adolescents. It can include hormones, and it can also include surgery, although that is extraordinarily rare, if not non-existent, for minors and adolescents, and it's even uncommon for many adults. So those are kind of some baseline kind of terms that I'll be using throughout this presentation, and I think that are just important to kind of set the stage for some of the legal disputes that are taking place when it comes to legal protections for transgender individuals. So, with that said, where we are right now is on one hand, we have seen a lot of states and some federal laws provide really substantial protections for transgender individuals. Um, and preventing discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So, for example, 28 states and the District of Columbia explicitly prohibit discrimination based on both sexual orientation and gender identity in public accommodations. Um, Similarly, federal law now in 24 states and DC prohibit employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. In 31 states and the District of Columbia prohibit that type of discrimination in housing as well. And so, when we think about what legal protections exist, particularly given the federal environment that we're going to talk about in a little bit, a lot of the protections that are most robust right now that ensure that transgender individuals have equal access to housing, employment, healthcare, and so forth are provided by state and local law. So at the same time as there are these, significant protections under state law, we've also been seeing a really tremendous backlash and attack against transgender individuals and the legal protections for transgender individuals. And that hasn't just been from the current federal administration. It's something that has really been picking up steam since 2020, 2021 or so. And initially was taking place in a number of states across the country, and then more recently, since the beginning of 2025, via just really relentless federal attacks by the current presidential administration. Um, so, some of these kind of attacks on the trans community have included laws prohibiting, for instance, in school, teaching about sexual orientation or gender identity, or permitting teachers to discuss their sexual orientation or gender identity. We've seen book bans in states. In over half the states, we've seen bans on healthcare treatment for transgender adolescents, and increasingly seeing that encroach into attacks on adult healthcare. And we've seen efforts to force disclosure of students' LGBTQ plus status. We've seen a significant number of states and now the federal government attempt to ban transgender youth from playing in sports, regardless of what sport it is and regardless of age and competition level. We've seen prohibitions against the use of trans individuals using public facilities consistent with their gender identity. And we've also been seeing an increased use of the criminal law, for instance, targeting change in vital records to reflect someone's gender identity. And that's kind of just a sliver of the types of attacks that we have been seeing from the past few years.
Hey
Um,
Josh, sorry if I can interrupt really quick. Would you be willing to share these slides with attendees after the presentation
yeah,
or
that
version?
that's no problem. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry. Thanks.
Yep. So that's kind of the high level overview. You have this kind of competing legal structure right now where some states have been really increasing their protections for LGBTQ individuals and particularly trans individuals. And then you also have states and now the federal government launching kind of really robust attacks against those legal protections. Um, and so I want to pivot from that kind of broad landscape and go into a few kind of the most salient issues in more depth so that we can see some of those tensions and how they play out across different issue areas and where various protections currently exist for trans individuals. One positive spot right now relates to employment. So Title VII is the federal law that prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of a number of protected characteristics, including sex. Now, the law itself does not use the term sexual orientation or gender identity, but in a 2020 Supreme Court case, Bostock versus Clayton County, what the Supreme Court said was there's no way to discriminate against someone on the basis of them being transgender or on the basis of their sexual orientation without their sex being a but-for cause of that discrimination. And so as a result, at least as it comes to that federal law and employment, um, there is a federal protection against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So essentially, what that means is under federal law, an individual cannot be terminated, they cannot be denied. Specific benefits of their employment, and an employer cannot refuse to hire someone on account of that person's gender identity or sexual orientation. And as we saw a little bit before, there are also a number of state laws that have similar protections um, in their own law. At the same time, though, as we now have this robust statutory protection, both federally and across a number of states against discrimination, we've also seen a really significant pullback from the federal government in terms of effectuating those protections through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And specifically, what we've seen is number one, the EEOC just refuse to consider claims on the basis of gender identity in when they decide whether to investigate a matter or not. And then number two, we've also seen the federal government change its interpretation to say of the law to say that, um, you know, denying an employee bathroom access that's consistent with their gender identity, in the government's view, doesn't fall under this prohibition in Title VII. Um, what I'll say on that is their interpretation. That is not the law, and that is something that has to be worked out through the courts. But we have, even notwithstanding the robust protection in federal law against discrimination here, we have seen a significant pullback in the federal government enforcing those protections. Um, One other area we're seeing a lot of dispute when it comes to employment protections relates to insurance coverage and whether an employer is allowed to deny an employee specific insurance coverage on account of their gender identity. And so I have this case listed there, Bernier versus TurboCam. It's a case my team is currently litigating. Our client is denied access to medically necessary gender transition medical care on account of the company's stated religious beliefs, and they are trying to say that their religious beliefs allows them to deny insurance coverage to this individual. And so that, issue is currently being litigated in the courts. So that's what's happening on the employment side. I want to turn now to healthcare because there's just been a tremendous amount over the past few years when it comes to legal protections for trans individuals in the healthcare space. And here, the news, has not been great. In particular, over the past few years, we've seen an increasing number of states, now about half of the states, ban transgender healthcare for adolescents. And this is, care that impartial medical associations have said constitutes the standard of care for adolescents, particularly bans on use of puberty blockers and hormone treatment. And very recently, the Supreme Court heard a case, U.S. versus Scarmetti, in which it considered the constitutionality of whether a state was allowed to ban this type of care for transgender adolescents. And what the Supreme Court said was yes, that this wasn't, in their view, an attack on um, transgender individuals, but it was the state's prerogative to regulate medical care on the basis of age and specific for a specific treatment, gender dysphoria. And so, in the court's view, those bans are lawful. And so, what that means is, as of right now, about half of the states have these bans in effect. And so, best practice trans healthcare for adolescents is only available in about half of the states. What I'll say there too is that the Skermeti decision was a decision based on the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. There are a number of other theories that have been used to try to challenge some of these bans, and the Supreme Court's decision only ultimately talked about the equal protection claim. So there might be other viable paths to challenge state bans that are outside of the equal protection context. We've also seen, though, just a nonstop federal attack on care for adolescents. The Trump administration has said since the beginning that their goal is to eviscerate this type of care. They came in and issued executive orders attempting to halt funding to any entity that provided the care. They have not been successful in doing that. There's a lawsuit. There are two lawsuits, one including PFLAG versus Trump, where there are injunctions in place preventing the federal government from withholding money to entities just because they provide trans health care. Those are currently on appeal, so more to come there. They also, in December 2025, issued a declaration from Secretary Kennedy at the Department of Health and Human Services, in which he essentially attempted to override state standards of care for the states that permit trans healthcare for adolescents, and essentially tried to say that the care was neither safe nor effective, and so funding could be pulled from any entity that provided it. Fortunately, there, though, um, about 22 states immediately filed a lawsuit, and that declaration has been enjoined. And the court in Oregon that issued that opinion, made very clear that the Secretary of HHS does not have the authority to override state standards of care in that way. Similarly, we've now seen the administration turn to its investigative powers to try to intimidate providers who provide this care. Initially, that was via what are called administrative subpoenas, in which the DOJ sent subpoenas seeking, among other things, the private health information for individuals who obtain this care. Um, More recently, in the past 2 weeks or so, the government impaneled. We learned that the government had impaneled a grand jury in Texas and has started to issue grand jury subpoenas for that same information from a number of hospitals. What I'll say on that is there have been a number of cases that have challenged the administrative subpoenas thus far, and court after court that has looked at them has halted the administration's ability to obtain the private health information in those cases, because those courts have found that the investigations have no real legitimate purpose, but were just designed to intimidate and harass. But I say all this just as another kind of use of a lever of power that the federal government has and that it's been employing to try to go after this healthcare and trans individuals. Similarly, the government has used the Federal Trade Commission to go after medical associations that have provided standards of care. A federal district court has halted the subpoenas that were issued to those entities. And so I guess one of the themes here as well is while there's been a lot of bad action when it comes to healthcare, there have also been a lot of really great court decisions that have halted a lot of the worst damage that could have already happened when it's as it relates to what the federal administration is trying to do. And the FTC investigations are one of those places so far. And then the final piece I'll flag when it comes to trans healthcare for adolescents is in December, at around the same time that the administration issued that declaration by Secretary Kennedy, they also issued two proposed rules that would pull significant funding from any entity that provided trans healthcare for adolescents under both Medicaid and Medicare, which would not only impact trans patients, but would impact the entire patient population for these providers. Those were just proposed rules, and when the government is currently reviewing the comments that were issued on those rules, and we anticipate later in the year that the administration will try to finalize those rules. But obviously, given the litigation that has occurred around most of the actions that have occurred thus far, I think it's a safe bet to say that the administration's actions in this area generally engender litigation because of the success that litigants have been having because of the lack of any real lawful basis for a lot of these actions. The last note I'll say on healthcare generally is while the focus has been on adolescent care, we've seen increasing attention being paid to adult care, particularly for federal employees, where coverage was eliminated for trans federal employees in 2025, and also in federal prison facilities, where we've seen the federal government so far unsuccessfully because of court action, attempt to pull back on its obligation to provide necessary health care for trans adults in federal facilities. So as much as has been happening in the healthcare space, there's been an equal amount happening as it relates to youth and families. And I'll try to go through these pretty quickly. One area relates to conversion therapy practices. Conversion therapy practices are, the discredited efforts to try to change somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity. And a significant number of states, about half the states, passed bipartisan laws over the past decade or two, barring that practice because every major medical association that has looked at conversion therapy has underscored the really significant damage that it can do to individuals. And what we've also found is that it, disrupts family ties and can also disconnect individuals from their faith communities. But recently, in February of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case called Childs versus Salazar, a challenge to Colorado's version of this law. And what the court said was, you know, what we're mostly talking about here is talk therapy, and that is protected under the First Amendment. And so any law that specifically limits a talk therapist's ability to opine on a specific issue in one specific way is subject to the most stringent constitutional scrutiny. And it has since sent that case back to the lower courts for further review. But the upshot is that the current method that states bar conversion therapy is, on pretty shaky constitutional ground at the moment. But what we've seen is states already respond to try to fix the constitutional problems that were identified, including a recent law in Colorado that was passed, because I think there is pretty widespread recognition about the danger of these practices. The other thing I would note there is the Supreme Court in its decision made clear that notwithstanding its views on the conversion therapy law, it was not in any way displacing other laws that might be applicable to survivors of conversion therapy practices, including medical malpractice cases. We've also seen the Supreme Court in a recent, what's called the shadow docket, reach this decision in this case, Mirabelli versus Bonta. And that case involved a California law that sought to protect LGBTQ students in school. And what the plaintiffs alleged was that if a student was using different names or pronouns at school, what the plaintiff said was that the law required the school to conceal that from the parents. And so what the Supreme Court said on kind of it's called the shadow docket or it's emergency docket. It's essentially a way to quickly reach an urgent issue without full briefing and argument. What it said was number one, that policy violated the specific plaintiff's religious beliefs and the parental rights to control the religious upbringing of their children. And number two, that it violated parental's substantive due process rights to control the upbringing of their children and be involved in, key mental health decisions as it relates to their children. Um, a few weeks after the court issued this decision, it then denied review in two other cases in which the lower courts upheld different versions of laws that protect LGBTQ students in schools. And, I think we're still working out how these different decisions kind of interact with one another. And I think there's going to be much more litigation on this. But what it seems like is the case is that the court, seemed particularly concerned about the concealment or the alleged concealment issue in the California law. Whereas in some of the other cases where the Supreme Court left in place lower court decisions upholding state protective state laws, there weren't the same type of kind of allegations of policies requiring that type of concealment, but instead really invited parents and schools to work together to protect youth. Um, so those are kind of two big issues in the youth and family space. There have also been a number of Title IX investigations launched by the federal administration against school districts across the country for having trans-inclusive policies as it relates to sports and restrooms, and also having LGBTQ inclusive curricula. And so I think, the top line there is that there are just a number of school districts across the country that are facing demands for information from the federal government, kind of as part of the federal effort to try to put pressure on those school districts for protecting LGBTQ youth. We have not seen kind of the resolution of any of those yet. At the same time, there's also been a number of changes related to the child welfare system. One is federal. Under the Biden administration, the Department of Health and Human Services put out a federal regulation designed to protect all youth, including LGBTQ youth, in foster care placements. The federal administration now is trying to rescind that regulation. We've also seen child welfare investigations in a number of states launched against parents that are trying to provide their children with the care and protection that they need. And we've also seen states increasingly attempt to pass bills in the child custody arena. And what this would do is redefine the best interest of the child standard, which is generally what governs family courts when they're deciding kind of child custody issues. And a lot of these laws, would essentially tie courts' hands and not allow them to consider, for instance, whether one parent is affirming and supportive of their child's sexual orientation and gender identity and another is not. So that's just something increasingly that we've been seeing. And then, I think sports and trans athletes' participation in youth sports, you know, obviously has been an issue in the public discourse for the last few years. We've seen an increasing number of states pass bans, all-out bans on trans participation in sports. This follows decades of local communities figuring this out kind of on a case by case basis, depending on the sport, depending on the age. And so these bans have overridden that in a lot of states. And there are now two cases pending at the Supreme Court on whether those bans are lawful or not. And we should have a decision on that in the next month or two. So turning then to a different topic, where we've seen a lot of action, access to vital documents. So birth certificates and driver's licenses that are consistent with an individual's gender identity. Um, and so, I'll just note a few things here. Number one is that state laws really vary on how easy or difficult it is for an individual to change their gender marker on their birth certificate or their driver's licenses. There are a number of states where it's, quite easy. There's a form that's really easy to understand, and there's no kind of proof required of a surgery or a court order. Um, and then, there are states that make it extremely difficult to update these vital documents. And some, even going so far as to attempt to penalize individuals for having vital documents that are accurately reflecting their gender identity. We've seen the federal government, although it has for decades allowed individuals to update their gender marker on their passports, and we've seen the government pull back from that. And while that had been enjoined or stopped by a federal court for some time, the Supreme Court, in one of those shadow docket orders in a case called Orr versus Trump, allowed the administration to move forward with preventing those updates from happening on federal vital documents. And then most recently in Kansas, we saw kind of a really disturbing action pop up, which was um, Kansas retroactively invalidated about 1,400 driver's licenses that had been updated to accurately reflect an individual's gender identity, which meant overnight somebody, a, a lot of people in Kansas had documents that were no longer valid and they could no longer, for instance, be driving with. So again, this is heavily state specific at this point, but we are seeing increasing attacks and new actions in places like Kansas, and also restrictions from the federal government. You know, on a practical level, you can imagine what this means for instance, a trans woman who is a woman in every sense of the word. For them to now, if they travel internationally, have to come back into the border crossing with a passport that reflects a male gender identity. You can just imagine, number one, the enormous burden and cost on the individual. But then number two, the dangerous situation that could potentially put someone. So, when we talk about vital documents, this is just an area that is, critically important as it relates to legal protections for transgender individuals. Um, so just a few more kind of issues to just quickly touch on. One relates to transgender service members in the military. And what we've seen here is over the past few years, there have been shifts in policy. So first, during the first Trump administration, the president barred trans individuals from joining the military, but trans individuals who were already serving in the military were allowed to continue to serve. President Biden reversed that policy and allowed trans individuals to both serve and join. And then at the beginning of the Trump 2 administration, there was an executive order barring both the joining of the military by transgender individuals and also that required the removal of transgender service members from the military. And so, these are folks who have been serving, many for decades, giving to their country, and now are in a position where the administration is, um, removing them from kind of their life's work and their dedication to the country. And so there have been a number of lawsuits that have challenged that ban. Um, you know, we in two of them there were so two of the cases, Talbot and Schilling, there were really good district court opinions striking down the ban on military service. On the shadow docket, the Schilling case got up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has allowed the ban to go into effect while that litigation moves forward. Um, so that's not to say that the litigation won't ultimately be successful, but it does mean that um, we're starting to see the separation of transgender service members from the military. Um, Two other cases here that I will just quickly flag. One is Ireland versus the US. Now, as part of this military ban in the Air Force and the Space Force, the Secretary promised individuals with certain years of service that they would be entitled to certain retirement benefits that, in some cases could equal to like $1 million over a lifetime, if not more. And then arbitrarily and as we argue, litigating the case inconsistently with what the law required, pulled back on that promise. And so individuals are suing to try to get the retirement that was promised to them. And then similarly, as part of its attack on trans individuals, the administration has, number one, excluded all coverage of trans health care for dependents of military service members under TRICARE, the healthcare system for individual service members and their families. And then number two, barred trans health care on at military health facilities. And Law and our partners at the National Center for LGBTQ Rights are also currently challenging that as an unlawful policy. Kind of very high level. Um, the government, in exchange for military service, has obligations to provide medical care to the service members and their dependents. It's kind of the least that the government can do in gratitude for these individuals' courageous service. And in our view, it's contrary to law to restrict it in the way that the administration has. Then the last issue I'll just very briefly touch before answering any questions that folks have. Just relates to trans individual safety in prisons. There's just such significant data on the risks that trans individuals face in prisons related, for instance, to sexual abuse and sexual violence. And the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003 was generally designed to target sexual violence in federal facilities and state facilities. Um, the federal government issued regulations that specifically protected transgender individuals and really required careful analysis of, the individual's placement for their safety and what type of facility, a male or female facility they would be in, what care that they would be provided and so forth. And what we've seen there, in addition to, the attempt to rescind healthcare for these individuals that I mentioned earlier is, number one, the administration has tried to just say that the rules that apply to protect transgender individuals under the Prison Rape Elimination Act don't apply, and that the auditors who go in and ensure that there is compliance with that law don't have to follow those regulations. Um, we recently filed a lawsuit on that on behalf of an individual because there are certain requirements that a federal agency has to go through before they can change regulations. They can't just issue a memo and say this no longer applies. And then the other piece, that we saw really from the start of the administration was an executive order that would have required the transfer of trans female individuals who were in female facilities be moved to male facilities. And so far in our litigation against that, our clients have remained in female facilities. All that litigation is still ongoing, and there is that kind of ongoing effort to try to move these females to male facilities. With that, I know it's a lot. I think again some positive spots as it relates to state law protections, as it relates to what the courts are doing to some of the actions. A lot of efforts to chip away at legal protections for trans rights. But I am happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for that. That was a lot of information, but it was really helpful. We do have some questions here in the Q&A. I can go ahead and read some of them. My child is close to 16 and looking forward to a driver's license. He has an F gender marker on Florida birth certificate, US passport, and Illinois health insurance policy. In this political climate, I doubt these existing documents can be changed anytime soon. What problems might arise if new documents like an Illinois driver's license has an M gender marker? So, like if those two documents have different gender markers, is it too unsafe these days to have documents with differing gender markers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I can't speak, to the specifics of the individual situation. I think like this is an unsatisfactory answer, but it's ultimately a risk calculus that every kind of individual and family has to make on their own. And so, some of the things I would think about would be, if I'm in Illinois, I'm in a state that has, really robust protections for transgender individuals and youth. Um, if I'm planning to not do international travel and stay in Illinois, then the fact that there's an updated driver's license as compared to, for instance, a passport, that inconsistency might not raise the same risk level. Um, at the same time, we've talked with folks who do travel internationally regularly or do cross state lines regularly. And, I've talked to a lot of people who have made kind of the other decision and have not changed their gender markers because of the specific risk calculus in their situation. Um, and so again, I know it's a really unsatisfactory answer, but it really just does depend on the individual specific circumstance. Um, what I would say is we so at Glad Law we have an ID project, a trans ID project, where we have kind of a team of partner attorneys who do work with individuals and can provide specific advice. And so, if this person is, interested in kind of exploring what changing a gender marker would look like, or how to do it, and or for guidance, that is one place that I would point folks to.
Cool. Um, can you tell us what documents or processes one might need to change their Illinois birth certificate and where to find the forms for this update?
Yeah, that. So I am not actually licensed in Illinois, and so I don't have the specific details on that. But number one, again, I think you can call our Glad Law Answers line, and we can get the specific information and resources to you for that. But I don't have the answer to that off the top of my head. I apologize.
Um, Um, this one's more of a comment, but I'll go ahead and read it anyways. What if the transgender community declared itself to be a religious group with its own belief system? They would have all the collective protections that the current religious groups currently get. Then any discrimination or exclusion would be considered persecution. Um,
Yeah.
use their own words and actions against them.
Yeah, so I can say a few things I think on the general sentiment of this. So number one, I think, we at Glad Law, and I know others in the movement, are actively trying to think about how some of the decisions that have been rendered against the LGBTQ community can be utilized to advance LGBTQ rights. Specifically, the Supreme Court has issued a lot of decisions really expanding the First Amendment as it relates to religious protections um, and others. And, that doesn't, I think to this person's point, like that doesn't necessarily only have to cut in one direction. Like we have talked with, um, you know, religious individuals in various states where access to, trans healthcare is related to a critical tenet of their religious beliefs. And so I say all of that to say that, like, number one, completely agree that, a lot of the law that is developing um, can't and shouldn't just be one direction. Um, so I think that's number one. Um, Number two, I think on kind of religion and LGBTQ rights more generally, one of the things we think a lot about and talk a lot about is just how much the popular narrative is that the two are in conflict with one another, and that's not the case. Like LGBTQ people, a lot of LGBTQ people are deeply religious. There is nothing inherently inconsistent with LGBTQ rights and religious rights. And, as we think about kind of the foundational promises of equality of the country, both of them need to be robustly protected for us to have the pluralistic society that I think a lot of us want to see, and that kind of is the birthright of those, of what this country is kind of is, on the path towards. Um, so I say all of that just to kind of uplift again I think some of the sentiment in that comment that while this isn't saying like create a new religion, it is saying that these are not necessarily in tension with one another. And I think it's critical that we not talk about the two like they have to be or always are in tension with one another.
That was really thoughtful. Okay, so I was in Rhode Island in 2000 when Jennifer Levi helped us pass trans civil rights into law. I've been familiar with your good work for years. How can we support the work of GLAD Law?
Thanks for asking that. And yeah, Jennifer is one of our senior directors on the team and is just trailblazing an incredible attorney who has done so much for the movement and the country. I think a few ways. Number one, we're always looking for volunteers for our Glad Law answers that I mentioned earlier. So that's one piece. Number two, we are always, we're a nonprofit organization, and so we'll always welcome financial contributions to help sustain and kind of our work and allow us to continue to grow what we're able to do. Number three, I think kind of related to those two, the more people who know about Glad Law, and so the more you're able to talk about the work that we're doing. I think we're always deeply appreciative of that. I'd also say kind of outside of, supporting Glad Law specifically, I think all of us right now who care about these issues, have an obligation to, number one, talk about what's happening, particularly with respect to the federal government. And so, you know, tell your friends who might not know that the federal government is using a criminal grand jury to try to get private health information about trans adolescents. Like, tell people that, because that doesn't just impact trans individuals, that impacts whether all of our health information is private and can remain private from the government. So that, that's one. And then I think related to that is, don't shy away from the difficult conversations with folks who disagree on these issues. And, we always say, approach those conversations with grace and patience. And certainly, not that there are some people where, there isn't going to be any common ground, but I think what um, I and my team have found is a lot of the narrative on these issues are focused on a few very specific issues like sports and healthcare for adolescents to try to create a wedge on these. But the vast majority of Americans support broad non-discrimination protections in places like public accommodation and housing and employment. And so there is a lot of common ground, I think, to work from. And so while not specifically helping like law as an organization, I do think that is a critical piece in helping to move forward the work that we're trying to move forward.
Um, what legal recourse is there to executive orders, specifically the early one declaring only two immutable genders?
Yeah, so there have been a number of lawsuits against the various executive orders that have been issued. On that one specifically, so in the cases that so so that executive order is the basis of the Bureau of Prisons policy that I mentioned, where the Bureau of Prisons is trying to transfer trans female inmates to male facilities. And so, we and partners have sued on that policy and have gone after that executive order as unlawful through that lawsuit. And so, I think most of these lawsuits are still kind of making their way through the court systems. Um, but, one of the things that um, I am most proud of being in the movement right now is there has not been a dangerous action that has occurred that has not been followed by a lawsuit.
Great. Okay, and then the last question, simply, can we get your contact information, or how can people reach out to you or Gladlaw?
Yeah, so if you're looking for kind of specific guidance for your like individualized circumstance, I think Law Answers would be the place to go. And I will in the chat um, put the link in. And then if you are just interested in either following up on anything I talked about, or have questions on anything I talked about, or want to partner in any way, I'm putting my email in the chat as well. Although I may
Oh,
have
I
only
think
sent it
that's
to
just
Hope.
going
Yeah,
to,
that may just be going to you.
yeah, that's okay. I'll copy and paste it.
Great,
I think,
thanks.
yeah.
So yes, feel free to. I can't. I do my best to get back to folks in a timely manner. But if I have delayed in any response, I apologize.
Cool. Well, oh, it won't let me copy your email for some reason. That's okay. Well, yeah, thank you everyone for um, coming and listening to this presentation. Like I said, this will be, I did end up recording the whole thing. Sometimes I cut off the Q&A, but we got the whole thing. So this will be up on the Evanston Public Library's YouTube channel probably next week. I would say look for it around Tuesday. And we will email you the slides as well. You can reach out to me. My name is Mark at mburgess@shypublib.org if you have any questions about this or any other the library presentation. And yeah, thank you, shypublib.org. Cool. Thank you. And yeah, thanks again, Josh.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.